My name is Eleanor Ashcroft, and I was 74 the night I finally let a room full of people see what I'd been carrying for 22 years. Everyone there thought they knew the story of my husband. Walter Ashcroft, the builder who lost his own company. The partner who couldn't be trusted with the books. The man whose own son stopped speaking to him because of it. They were wrong about all of it. I'd known the truth since the spring of 2003, sitting at my kitchen table at 11 at night with a photocopier warm under my hands. I never said a word. Not for love of peace. For love of my husband, who begged me not to. Stay with me, because the man being honored on that stage that night, the man with the microphone and the tears in his eyes, was about to learn that the woman in the third row hadn't forgotten a single page. Welcome back to Alpha Mom Stories, where women who were underestimated finally get the last quiet word. If a calm voice and a hard truth sound like justice to you, you're home. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. Walter and Gordon Pierce met in 1974, two 22-year-olds swinging hammers on the same framing crew outside Harrisburg. Gordy was the talker. Walt was the one who checked his level twice. By 1976 they'd pulled $1,100 between them and rented a single lot. Ashcroft and Pierce Builders, the sign said, hand-painted, nailed to a fence post. Gordy found the clients. Walt built the houses that made those clients call their friends. I married Walt in 1975, a year into the partnership, and I want you to understand what kind of man I married before I tell you what was done to him. Walt believed a level didn't lie to you. He believed a foundation poured crooked would show itself eventually, no matter how good the paint job on top. He had a brass spirit level his own father gave him, engraved on the side, A&P, True and Plum, 1974. He used that exact level on every house he ever framed for 40 years. He still keeps it on the mantle now, though these days his hands shake too much to hold it steady. I was the company's bookkeeper for the first 11 years, before we could afford to hire one. I know what True and Plum cost him. 12-hour days. Missed birthdays. A back that never fully recovered from 1988. Gordy was different. Gordy loved the finish line more than the work. He loved the ribbon cutting, the local paper photo, the rounds he'd buy at the bar after a closing. People liked Gordy. People trusted Gordy on site, the easy kind of trust that a level, careful man like my husband had to earn slowly, one honest house at a time. By 1998 the company had grown into something real. 60 employees. A pension fund. A name people in 3 counties recognized. Ashcroft and Pierce built the elementary school addition, the Lutheran Church Hall, half the subdivisions off Route 9. Our son David grew up on job sites, in a hard hat 2 sizes too big, calling Gordy Uncle Gordy before he could say his own last name properly. Gordy had no children of his own. He treated David like a nephew, taught him to drive a stick shift in an empty church parking lot, walked him down the aisle at his rehearsal dinner years later when Walt's back gave out the week before and he couldn't stand for long stretches. 40 years of that kind of closeness doesn't announce itself as dangerous. It announces itself as family. That's exactly what made it so easy for Gordon Pierce to take my husband apart from the inside, one signature at a time, and have my own son believe it was his father's doing. It started small, the way these things always do. A discrepancy of $4,200 in the equipment account, spring of 2001. I found it doing the quarterly reconciliation I still handled from home even after we'd hired an outside accountant. I mentioned it to Walt over dinner. Probably a coding error, he said. I'll ask Gordy about it Monday. Monday came and went. So did the explanation. Equipment lease timing, Gordy said. Nothing to worry about. I let it go. You do that, when you've trusted a man for 25 years. You let the first wrong number pass because the alternative, that your husband's best friend is lying to your face over pot roast, is not a thought a reasonable person reaches for first. The second discrepancy was harder to wave off. $17,000 routed to a vendor account for a supplier I'd never heard of, no invoice attached, coded under materials, miscellaneous. I asked Walt to ask again. This time Gordy got short with him. Told him bookkeeping wasn't his department, told him to trust his partner the way partners were supposed to trust each other, told him, and Walt repeated this to me almost apologetically, already halfway to believing it himself, that a company their size couldn't survive Walt auditing every receipt like he didn't trust his own brother. Brother. That was the word Gordy used. If you've ever watched someone you love get talked out of their own instincts by a person who knows exactly which words will work on them, you already know where this is going. Type I see it in the comments if you do. By late 2002 I'd stopped mentioning what I found. Not because I stopped looking. Because I'd started keeping my own file. I photocopied everything that crossed our kitchen table before Walt filed it back at the office. Bank statements. Vendor invoices. The handwritten ledger pages. Gordy still insisted on keeping himself for the big accounts, a habit I now understand had nothing to do with old-fashioned pride and everything to do with the fact that a handwritten page is so much easier to alter than a typed one. I copied it all in the evenings after Walt fell asleep, the machine humming in the garage where he wouldn't hear it, and I put the copies in a fireproof box under the workbench, behind the paint cans, where a level, careful man would never think to look, because he wasn't the one hiding anything. I told myself I was being careful. Overly cautious. A bookkeeper's habit, nothing more. I didn't yet know how badly I'd need that box. ACT3, the ledger that didn't add up. The spring of 2003 is when the wrong number stopped being small. The pension fund audit came due, standard practice, required every 3 years for a company that size. Walt handled the paperwork himself that year because our regular accountant had retired and the new one hadn't started yet. He brought the audit binder home on a Thursday night, set it on the kitchen table, and asked me to double-check his addition before he signed the cover letter. Old habit of ours. For eyes on anything with the word pension attached to it. I found it at 9:40 that night. $93,000 missing from the fund, moved out in 11 transactions over 14 months, each one just under the threshold that would have triggered an automatic flag from the plan administrator. Each one authorized with a signature. Walt's signature. Except it wasn't. I'd watched my husband sign his name across a kitchen table for 28 years. I knew the particular hitch in his W, the way the final stroke of his T always dragged slightly right because of an old injury to his index finger. These signatures didn't have the hitch. They didn't have the drag. They were close. Close enough to fool a bank teller glancing at a withdrawal slip. Not close enough to fool a wife who'd watched that hand write 1,000 grocery lists. I didn't say anything to Walt that night. I sat at the table after he'd gone to bed, and I photocopied all 11 pages, and I laid my hand flat on the stack the way you'd check a level for true. 60 employees had money in that fund. Men Walt had hired off framing crews and kept on for 20 years. Roofers with bad knees counting on that pension to carry them through retirement. The next morning I called a forensic document examiner I found through an old client of mine, a woman named Priscilla Okafor who did handwriting verification for the county courts on the side. I told her I needed a private opinion, discreet, no paper trail back to my husband's company yet. She looked at 11 signatures and 4 authentic samples I'd copied from old company checks, and she called me back in 9 days with a 2-page written opinion. These are not the same hand, she told me over the phone. Whoever produced these had access to a genuine sample and a decent eye. But the pressure points are wrong. The habitual dragged stroke on the T is absent in all 11 instances. In my professional opinion, these signatures are not consistent with your husband's known writing. I asked her to put that in writing and sign it herself. She did. I have that letter still. I've had it for 22 years. I want to pause here, because this is the part where people always ask me the same question. Why didn't I go straight to the police that week? Why didn't I hand Priscilla's letter to a lawyer on a Monday morning and let the truth land exactly where it belonged? I almost did. I sat with my car keys in my hand on a Tuesday morning, the letter in an envelope on the passenger seat, fully intending to drive to the county prosecutor's office before my nerve failed me. But that same week, Walt collapsed at a job site. Heat exhaustion, the doctor said at first, though within a year it would have a different name, the tremor in his left hand that never fully went away, the beginning of what we now know as Parkinson's. He was 55 years old and frightened in a way I'd never seen him frightened, and when I sat by his hospital bed that night, he took my hand and said the only thing he asked of me in 40 years of marriage that I now regret giving him. "Don't go after Gordy, Nora. Whatever you found. Please. I can't survive a scandal on top of this. The men on that crew can't survive the company folding while I'm laid up. Let me handle it quiet. Let me get him to make it right without burying us all in the papers." I put the letter back in the fireproof box. I told myself it was temporary. A pause, not a surrender. If you've ever swallowed the truth to protect someone you loved, and watched that silence get used against you for years afterward, you understand exactly what came next. That's the real reason I'm telling you this story, and I promise you, the worst of it hasn't happened yet. Walt did try to handle it quietly. He confronted Gordy alone, in the office, on a Saturday when the crew was off. I wasn't there. I only have Walt's account of it, given to me haltingly that night, a man twice my husband's size and competence somehow reduced to stammering. Gordy didn't deny it outright. He cried, Walt said. Told him it was a temporary borrow against a bad quarter, that he'd been 2 months from a balloon payment on a second mortgage nobody knew he'd taken out, that his ex-wife's lawyer had threatened to garnish everything he had left after the divorce, that he'd panicked and told himself he'd pay every dollar back before anyone noticed. I want to be fair to Gordon Pierce here, because a person is rarely only one thing. He grew up the son of a man who lost the family hardware store to the bank in 1966, watched auctioneers carry furniture out to the curb at 11 years old while neighbors stood on the lawn to watch. He built his whole adult identity around never being that poor, that visible, that pitted again, and somewhere in his 40s that fear curdled into something that let him justify taking from 60 men's retirements rather than let his own name touch scandal one more time. That doesn't excuse what he did. It explains why a person capable of 40 years of real, warm friendship could also do it. Walt believed him. Believed the tears, believed the promise to pay it back over 18 months out of his own draw, believed that exposing him would end 2 families and 60 jobs for nothing, since the money, Gordy swore, would be fully restored before the next audit. So Walt agreed to bury it. He didn't report it. He didn't tell the board. He restructured the pension contributions himself, quietly, folding the shortfall into the operating budget over the following 2 years, taking almost no draw for himself in that stretch to cover the gap, working sicker and longer than any partner half his age should have. He never told our accountant the real reason for the belt-tightening. He never told David. And that is precisely the opening Gordon Pierce needed. Because 2 years later, when the company's cash position looked thin from all that quiet patching, and a competitor made a run at 2 of their biggest contracts, Gordy needed someone to blame for the thin years, and he could not, under any circumstance, let that someone be him. So at a partners' meeting in November 2004, in front of the accountant and 2 junior managers, Gordon Pierce raised his voice for the first time in the whole ordeal and asked, with wounded, theatrical concern, whether anyone else had noticed how erratic Walt's decision-making had gotten since his health scare. Whether the company could survive another 2 years of a founder who couldn't keep his own signature straight anymore. His own signature. He used the very forgery he'd committed as evidence that my husband was losing his grip. I wasn't in that room. I only learned the details years later from a woman named Roz Petrakis, the company's original bookkeeper before I'd handed the job off, who sat through that meeting taking minutes with her hands shaking under the table, because she'd seen the same discrepancies I had and hadn't known what to do with what she knew either. By early 2005, under pressure Walt still refused to explain to anyone. He agreed to step back from daily operations for his health. Gordy bought out his remaining stake at a price a good lawyer would have laughed out of the room, a fraction of what Walt's 40 years of true plum building had earned. The company was renamed Pierce Construction Group within the year. And somewhere in that same stretch, David, 26 years old and hearing only Gordy's version, the version where his father had made some questionable calls with the books and wasn't quite himself anymore, began to pull away from his own father. Nobody sat David down and told him it was a forgery. Nobody had to. Gordy's version required no lie so large it would need defending. Just a steady drip of concerned half-truths, delivered with a hand on David's shoulder at every family gathering Walt was too proud and too broken to attend. By the time David married in 2008, he asked Gordy to be his best man. Not his own father. Walt sat in the second row of his son's wedding, and I sat beside him, and neither of us said one word about why. I want to be honest with you about what those years did to me, because I think a lot of you watching know exactly this kind of silence from the inside. I watched my son's face change when Gordy's name came up at Thanksgiving, warm and easy, the same face he never once turned toward his own father. I watched Walt's hands start to shake worse every year, and I never knew how much of that tremor was disease and how much was a decade of swallowing the truth every single time David asked, carefully, gently, whether Dad was doing okay these days, health-wise. I kept the fireproof box. Every few years I'd take it out, check that the ink hadn't faded, add Priscilla's letter, add a copy of the buyout agreement that valued Walt's 40 years at 11 cents on the dollar, add the pension audit that eventually, quietly, did get corrected once Gordy's replacement contributions finally squared the books, though under an explanation that conveniently never mentioned whose signature had been forged in the first place. I asked Walt, more than once over the years, whether the time had come to tell David the truth. Every time, the same answer. What good does it do now, Nora? The company's his. David loves him. I won't be the old man who tears that down out of spite in my last years. I respected that answer for a long time. I stopped respecting it the year Walt's diagnosis stopped being manageable and started being urgent. 2 years ago, at 75, he began forgetting words mid-sentence, needing help with buttons, sitting quiet through whole dinners where once he'd have held the table. I watched a disease start taking apart a man who'd already had his name, his company, and his own son quietly taken apart by someone he'd trusted since he was 22 years old, and I made a private decision the fireproof box would not stay in the garage forever. I didn't know yet what would finally bring it out. I found out on a Tuesday in September, when an invitation arrived with a gold foil border and Pierce Construction Group's logo across the top. You are cordially invited to celebrate 50 years of building, at the Pierce Legacy Gala, honoring the visionary who built it all, Gordon R. Pierce. 50 years. My husband's name did not appear once on the entire card. Not in the history paragraph on the back, which credited Gordy alone with founding the company in 1976. Not on the guest of honor line. Not anywhere. I found out 3 weeks later, from Ross Petrakis, who still had friends inside the company, that Gordy had a book coming, a memoir titled Built to Last, due out the same month as the gala, and that an early copy circulating among staff described his difficult early partner as a man whose erratic bookkeeping and declining judgment had nearly sunk the company before Gordy steadied the ship alone. He was writing Walt's forgery into history as Walt's crime. And David, my son, was listed as a keynote speaker at the gala, set to give a toast honoring the man who was more of a father to me than anyone. I sat with that invitation in my hands for a long while. I thought about driving straight to David's house and telling him everything on his own doorstep, and I almost did, keys in hand again, the way I had 22 years earlier. But I've learned something in 74 years that I didn't know at 52. A truth told in private, to a man who has spent 2 decades loving the wrong father figure, can be argued with, softened, explained away by the very person who lied to him first. A truth told in a room full of witnesses, backed by paper that speaks for itself, cannot. So I called Priscilla Okafor, 79 now and still sharp as a blade, and asked if her old opinion would still hold up beside a fresh comparison sample. I called Roz Petrakis and asked if she'd be willing to say, out loud, in front of people, what she'd watched in that 2004 meeting. I had the buyout agreement and the corrected pension filing certified as copies of record. I wrapped Walt's brass level in a soft cloth and put it in my bag, not as evidence of anything, only because some nights, watching him struggle to find his words, I think that level is the truest thing either of us has left. I RSVP'd yes for both of us. I told Walt only that we were attending. He still didn't want it disturbed, even then, and there is a particular ache in loving a man too gentle to defend himself and having to decide, finally, to defend him without his blessing. I made that decision anyway. The ballroom at the Whitmore Hotel held 300 people that November night, and every one of them was there to watch Gordon Pierce receive an award for a company built, in his telling, entirely on his own two hands. Walt wore his good gray suit. His hands trembled around the water glass, and I placed my hand over his to steady it, the way I have every day for 3 years now, and neither of us needed words for that. David sat 2 tables up, in a tuxedo, rehearsing his toast on a note card. I could see him running his thumb over. Gordy took the stage at 8:15 to a standing ovation. 76 years old, silver-haired, magnificent in the particular way of a man who has spent decades being believed. He talked about grit. About a boy who watched his father's store get auctioned off the sidewalk. About building something, he said, with my own 2 hands, and never once losing my nerve when the easy thing would have been to quit. He never said Walt's name once in 11 minutes. Then he called David up for the toast, the son I never had, and the room went soft and misty, and David stood at that microphone and said the words I'd been dreading for 3 weeks. Gordy, you were more of a father to me than my own dad ever managed to be, and I mean that with love. You taught me what it looks like to build something honest. Honest. I felt Walt's hand go still under mine, not from tremor this time, from something quieter and worse. I stood up. I want you to understand I did not shout. I did not cry. I walked to the small standing microphone near the gift table that the MC had left for toasts, and I asked, in the same voice I've used my whole life to ask a butcher for a specific cut of meat, whether I might add one thing to the celebration of 50 years. The room turned, curious, polite, the way a room turns for an old woman in a navy dress they assume will say something sentimental about how proud she is. My name is Eleanor Ashcroft, I said. Walter's wife. 49 years now. A ripple of recognition. A few people glanced at Walt, surprised, I think, that he was even in the room. I have 3 exhibits, I said, and then I'll sit back down and let you get to dessert. I opened the folder. Exhibit 1. A forensic handwriting comparison, dated April 2003, confirming that 11 signatures on the company's 1998 through 2001 pension authorizations, all bearing my husband's name, do not match his known hand. The examiner's written opinion and credentials are attached. I laid it on the podium and let the paper speak. Exhibit 2. The buyout agreement from 2005, in which my husband's 40-year stake in a company he co-founded, physically built the first 14 houses with his own hands, was purchased for 11 cents on the dollar of independently appraised value, 3 months after he was pressured to step back over, quote, erratic decision-making that Gordon himself introduced into a partners' meeting. A woman near the front, I'd know her anywhere by now, stood quietly from a middle table. Roz Petrakis, 80 years old, in a lavender dress, her hand steady where it had shaken 22 years earlier. I was in that meeting, Roz said, her voice carrying clean across the room. I took the minutes myself. Gordon Pierce raised the question of Walter's competence in that room. Nobody else did. I have never loved a near stranger as much as I loved Roz Petrakis in that moment. Exhibit 3, I said, and I looked, finally, not at the room, but at Gordy himself, who had gone the color of old paper, is simpler. It's a level. I set Walt's brass spirit level on the podium, the engraving catching the ballroom light. A&P, True and Plum, 1974. My husband built with this for 40 years, I said. He never once framed a wall he wouldn't stand under himself. I'd ask everyone in this room tonight to consider which of these 2 men that describes. The room was not laughing anymore. Gordy started toward the podium, already talking, already reaching for the same soft, wounded voice he'd used on my husband in that office 22 years earlier. Nora, this isn't the place. You told my husband the exact same thing in 2003, I said, still calm, still even. It wasn't the place then either. Forgive me for finding a better one. I turned, at last, to my son. David. I know what you were told, and I know why you believed it. He raised you almost as much as we did, and a lie told with love in his voice for 22 years is a hard thing to doubt. I'm not asking you to doubt it tonight because I said so. I'm asking you to read 3 pages I've had photocopied and locked in a fireproof box under my garage workbench since you were 24 years old. Then decide for yourself who built what. Gordy did not deny it outright, not that night. He said, thin and stammering, something about context, about a hard year, about how none of us understood the pressure he'd been under. Context. Such a small word, doing such heavy lifting for a man who let a sick partner absorb the blame for his own theft for 2 decades. Sorry is a beginning, not an ending, and Gordon Pierce did not even manage the beginning that night. David called us the next morning, before 8, his voice raw in a way I hadn't heard since he was a boy with a skinned knee. He'd read Priscilla's letter twice at his kitchen table at 2 in the morning. He'd called Roz himself and made her repeat every detail. He drove to our house that afternoon, sat across from his father at the same kitchen table where I first found that $4,200 discrepancy in 2001, and apologized in a way that took most of an hour and several long silences to finish. Walt, in the gentle, faltering voice the disease has left him, told our son the only thing he'd wanted to say for 22 years. I never blamed you for believing him, David. I blamed myself for staying quiet long enough that you had to. The fallout moved fast once the paper trail was public. Built to Last was pulled from its release schedule within the week, the publisher citing factual concerns requiring further review. Pierce Construction Group's board, facing a forensic letter, a corroborating witness, and a corrected pension audit all dated years before any of this became public, quietly opened its own internal review. Gordon Pierce resigned as chairman 2 months later. I'm told the founder's wall in the company lobby now carries both names again, in equal-sized letters, a small and late correction that cost the company nothing and cost Gordy, I imagine, everything he'd spent 2 decades protecting. I don't know what became of the friendship. Some things, once broken this precisely, don't mend into anything you'd still call by the same name. Gordy sent one letter, unopened on my kitchen counter for 3 weeks before Walt finally read it alone one evening and never mentioned what it said. I didn't ask. Some doors, once you've had to force them open in front of 300 strangers, don't need reopening a second time. David calls his father every Sunday now, not to check on the tremor, though he does that too, but to talk, the way sons are supposed to talk to fathers who taught them to drive stick shift in an empty lot, except it's Walt teaching him to read a level properly now, patient, even with hands that shake, because some things a man can still pass down long after his hands stop cooperating with his heart. Walt still keeps the brass level on the mantle. Some mornings he asks me to hand it to him, and he holds it against the windowsill just to watch the bubble settle true, the way he's done every morning of our marriage, a small, stubborn ritual that has outlasted a stolen fortune, a forged signature, and 40 years of a friendship that turned out to be built on nothing level at all. If there's one thing I'd ask you to carry out of this story, it's this. Protecting someone you love from a painful truth is not the same as protecting them from harm. Sometimes the silence you keep to spare a man's pride is the exact silence that lets the real damage keep happening in a room he's not even allowed into anymore. I loved my husband enough to stay quiet for 22 years. I loved him more, in the end, by finally speaking. If you've ever carried the truth alone to protect someone who couldn't yet carry it themselves, and you finally set it down where it belonged, tell me about it in the comments. I read every one. And if this found you tonight, subscribe, because there's always another quiet woman with a folder full of the truth, waiting for the right room to open it in.